My name is Emma Ballou, and I'm the curator here at the Southampton Historical Museum. We're very excited about this lecture, also because we have a new exhibit, Southampton Under Siege, which I invite all of you to take a look at afterwards. And if you have any questions, just come find me, or probably Natalie will be able to answer them as well. So we are very excited to have Natalie here today. She is an expert on Long Island history. She was a professor at Hofstra for over 30 years, teaching American social history, and we are proud to have 3 of her books for sale in our gift shop, which she has said that she would be willing to sign if any of you would like to purchase one afterwards. So without further ado, I'd like to learn about Long Island women's role in the American Revolution.
Thank you, Emma. And yes, do visit the wonderful exhibit just across the hall on the Southampton Under Siege. Let me begin. The website says it started at 11:09, which I'm sure was a typo, but nonetheless, you notice I'm wearing my red jacket for the red coats. But I want to begin with a variation of the quiz that I would give the first day of class in my women's history class when I was teaching at Hofstra. What women can you name from the Revolutionary War era in American history or in Long Island history? Any? Yes.
Abigail Adams.
Abigail Adams. Okay.
Betsy Ross.
Martha Washington.
Betsy Ross.
Betsy Ross, who did not make the first American flag. She's in a lot of the history books.
Peggy Arnold.
Peggy Arnold, Peggy Shippen Arnold.
Anna Strong.
Benedict's wife. Yes.
Anna Strong.
Anna Strong. Come to her. Yes. Anyone else? 5. That's about it. I think my students averaged, and it was just American history, averaged 3 books. And it was usually Betsy Ross, Martha Washington, and their mother. Anyway, it's almost 9:05. 11:05. Gloria Steinem once said, "Women have always been an equal part of the past. They just haven't been part of history." Well, the war on American soil provided opportunities for heroism by ordinary people, and that included women. But one of my themes today is myth versus reality. Near my hometown of Peekskill, upstate, there's a memorial that was erected in 1921 at Continental Village, where the Patriot troops were stationed during the war. The plaque on the stone states, and I'll quote, "In memory of the mothers of the Revolution who watched and prayed while our fathers fought that we might be free." Now, I've always appreciated that recognition of women. It claims to be the first and maybe still be the only such one to the women of the Revolutionary War. But my goal today is to demonstrate that women did more than simply watch and pray during the war on Long Island, and that was the case elsewhere as well. And I hasten to say that I am not about to try to claim that women won the war or that they played a major role, but their experience has been largely invisible in the historical accounts. The exceptions on Long Island, Sally Townsend, that no one mentioned, but she's in Nassau County, today's Nassau County, Oyster Bay, and Nancy Strong, which was mentioned. I'll come to them, but let me say that their experiences have been romanticized and exaggerated, I think. In the 1700s, including during the Revolutionary War, women's sphere was in the home, not the public arena. So that official records, newspapers, historical accounts overwhelmingly report on the activities of men. And only occasionally do you find women's names. But the soldiers and other patriots and loyalists, whose names are in the history books, had wives, mothers, and daughters who became, some of whom became widows or orphans when the men were killed in battles or in skirmishes. When the British took control of the island after the Battle of Long Island in late 1776, and the exhibit has a reproduction, this is the postcard for the exhibit, of Alonzo Chappelle's painting of the Battle of Long Island, or at least one aspect of it. And I was interested to find that Alonzo Chappelle lived in Middle Island and painted this while he was living there. He'd previously been in Brooklyn. So another Long Island connection, and he was a very popular illustrator of historical scenes in the 19th century, largely forgotten today. But after that Battle of Long Island, many women went with their families to Connecticut as refugees. They, as well as those who returned on the island, had their land disrupted. We had seats being saved for the children up here in front, if you want. I know she said, who are not playing hooky from school, but are homeschooled, so you don't have to worry. Many people, many women had their homes and farms destroyed as a result of the British occupation of the island. So I'll turn to some specific examples. In the mid-1760s, the English Parliament enacted taxes on the American colonists. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and the colonist economic boycotts organized in response would not have been effective if the women had not found substitutes for refusing to purchase tea, cloth, and other goods imported from Britain. So the Daughters of Liberty took out, Daughters of Liberty? Yes, Daughters of Liberty. There were not just Sons of Liberty, but Daughters of Liberty. And they would spin, took out their spinning wheels and wove homespun. And there was a Boston newspaper in 1769 that reported, and I'll quote here, 3 young ladies at Huntington on Long Island, namely Letitia, something happened on my, let me get it. Letitia, sorry, Ermina, Letitia, and Sabrina, having met together, agreed to try their dexterity at the spinning wheel. Accordingly, the next morning they sit themselves down and, like the virtuous woman, put their hands to the spindle and held the distaff. At evening they had 26 skeins of good linen yarn, each skein containing 4 ounces, all of which were the effects of that day's work only. The account in the Boston newspaper, which encouraged Boston women to follow the example of the Long Island women. And it stated, the ladies, while they vie with each other in skill and in industry in their profitable employment, may vie with the men in contributing to the preservation and prosperity of their country and equally share in the honor of it. Now, not all Long Island women were involved in those years. We have the diary of Mary Cooper for the years from 1768 to 1773. She lived in what is today Oyster Bay Cove, not very far from Theodore Roosevelt's home, Sagamore Hill. In fact, Roosevelt talks about sliding down Cooper's Bluff, named for the Cooper family. And her diary includes the usual weather and so on, but there is no mention at all of politics in her diary, though it covers the years from 1768 to 1773. She talks about schisms in the church, but not politics. So the population of Long Island, including Queens and Kings counties, was 28,000 just before the war. Nearly half were in Suffolk. Like many of the Long Island, like many of the middle colonies, was divided on the question of the conflict, at least before the fighting. We sometimes forget that the American Revolution was a civil war. It is usually said that Suffolk County was overwhelmingly patriot, and it probably was. But the majority of the population in Kings County, we would today think of it as Brooklyn, and it had the smallest number in 1771, only 13% of the population. I mean, we tend to think of Western Long Island as the most populated today, but in 1770s, Suffolk was larger, of course, larger area as well. So Kings County were loyalists or Tories predominantly. Queens, that included present-day Nassau County, was divided. Patriots in the northern part of Hempstead literally seceded in September 1775. And that split was confirmed after the war by the division of the town into North Hempstead and South Hempstead. The latter is now simply the town of Hempstead, town of North Hempstead. But the divisions in Queens County were not equal. Recent estimates are that a majority of those in Queens, 60%, were apolitical or neutral, 27% loyalists, and only 12% patriot. And those percentages are based on those who publicly affirmed their allegiance, signing one of the documents, and refers only to the men. Before the outbreak of full-fledged war, the New Jersey Patriot Militia came to Long Island in January 1775 to disarm, as they called it, the disaffected, those who didn't agree with them, the loyalists. They arrested several prominent loyalists, and among those was Dr. Samuel Martin of Rockaway area in Hempstead, and he was imprisoned for a number of months. Samuel's father, Josiah, was in his mid-70s at that point and in poor health. And that left the household of 3 generations at Rock Hall in today's Lawrence in the southwestern section of Nassau County in the hands of women. Patriot soldiers occupied the Martin home, included Josiah's wife Mary, his daughters Betsy, Alice, and Rachel, and Betsy's 3 daughters aged 6 months to 13 years. Betsy's husband had been the royal governor of North Carolina. They had driven him out. The family fled, and Josiah, the father, was on a British warship in the New York harbor. When he, after the Battle of Long Island, and he was able to reunite with his family in Rock Hall. He wrote that the women had been exposed to the most mortifying insults of the ruling mob and had suffered the mortification of being obliged to entertain the ragamuffins who ordered in their house. Now, the experiences at Rock Hall, which is now a historic house museum, was not an isolated incident. There would be many others during the war, whether by patriots or loyalists. We don't always have the names or details about those, but it was a very common experience. In mid-August 1776, when Patriot militia were protecting cattle on the Rockaway Peninsula, it was a woman who first alerted the men that the British were coming. Nellie Cornell, after looking out an upper window, told a Patriot officer that she saw trees rising from the ocean. And that was the British fleet bringing soldiers to Staten Island, where they landed first. They would be engaged in that Battle of Long Island at the end of the month. That was the one major battle on Long Island that occurred in today's Greenwood Cemetery and Prospect Park area. Now, that battle was a defeat for the Patriots. They were badly outnumbered, but they were outflanked because they had left the Jamaica Pass very poorly guarded. Now, that could have been the end of the war if General Washington had not successfully evacuated his troops across the East River, and the British failed to follow up on their victory. Rain, fog, and unfavorable winds helped the Patriots. Large numbers of Patriots were killed or taken prisoners. Washington's successful evacuation of his troops was almost foiled by a woman, Mrs. John Rapelye, who saw the troops, and she sent a slave to tell the British about it, but he was captured by Hessians, and they couldn't understand what he was trying to say, and so it was not till the next morning, when it was too late, that he got the message delivered. Many officers, when captured, were paroled in Brooklyn with private families, the Patriot families. Women had the responsibility for feeding and sheltering the prisoners. American authorities paid for their care. That was part of the understandings of the war at that time. But many women whose names we do not know provided food to prisoners, nursed wounded soldiers without compensation. You may remember that the Quartering Act before the war was one of the grievances that would be cited in the Declaration of Independence. And remember that soldiers living in one's home meant not only the disruption of household routines, but the burden of feeding them. And I'll give some more examples later. I want to share an incident. I don't know whether this is one of the books that's in there or not, but this occurred after the British landed in Brooklyn, shortly before the actual battle, in fact, and comes from Gertrude Lefferts Vanderbilt, who recorded in the late 19th century, recorded stories that she had heard from her grandmother, Timothy Lefferts, who at the time was 15 or 16 years old. And I reprinted excerpts in this book, Journeys on Old Long Island, and let me read from her account, as recorded by Gertrude Vanderbilt. We had a woodlot at the north end of the farm, known familiarly as Nova Scotia. There was no undergrowth, and as the grass was luxuriant, Here the horses were pastured. One morning an English officer came in great haste to Caesar. Caesar was the enslaved African that the family owned, asking for his horse. Caesar, who had no great opinion of British troops, seeing the trouble that their coming had given, replied, without looking up from his work, that the horse was in Nova Scotia. "How dare you send my horse to Nova Scotia?" demanded the Englishman, getting very red in the face. The old colored man looked up in surprise, but he merely said that the master had ordered it to be sent there. The officer stamped his foot in rage. "I tell you, I want my horse. I meant to use him this very day. What right had he to send him away?" Caesar thought his conduct was certainly remarkable, inasmuch as there was no better pasture than Nova Scotia lawn for miles around. In great rage, the Englishman advanced toward the house. He was too much of a gentleman to be rude to a young girl who received him with politeness. And when I met him at the door, the struggle between his anger and the desire to appear calm kept him silent. I invited him in, and knowing him to be the owner of one of the finest horses in the pasture lot, I sent Mink down to bring down the financier. It's the name of the horse. The struggle to repress his pent-up indignation was ineffectual. You may imagine his embarrassment when, in the midst of his reproaches, he looked up and saw his spirited horse come gaily catering down the farm lane. He was a kind-hearted man and very much of a gentleman. He could scarcely forgive himself for being so rude, and he tried in every way to make reparation for his conduct. He was a fast friend of ours after that, and was enabled by his position to do us many an act of kindness, which in our defenseless state we certainly needed. Caesar was not as reticent as we wished him to be, and when the officers got hold of the story, they joked him for months after the disposition which the rebels had made of his horse. I love that story. During the war, or during the battle, I forget at which point, anyway, the Lefferts' home was burned. They rebuilt it after the war, or late in the war, and you can visit that in Prospect Park. The Lefferts' home is from 1780 or so. It's there. After that defeat in the Battle of Long Island, or Battle of Brooklyn, the New York Convention recommended that Long Islanders send as many as possible of their women, children, and slaves, together with grain and livestock, to Connecticut. The assumption was that patriot men would be serving in the militia or the army. And those refugees of Long Island are estimated to number nearly 5,000. That was more than 15% of the pre-war population of the island. Most were from Suffolk County, whose men, as I've said, were most outspoken about their opposition to the British. Perhaps 30% of Suffolk's population became refugees in Connecticut. And it wasn't easy for those refugees who had only what they could carry, and often no land or homes there. Some women did stay on the island. Many able-bodied men were in the Patriot militia and left Long Island after the defeat in Brooklyn in late August 1776. The British recruited Loyalist men to serve in their military, the Provincial Corps, the Delancey Brigade, and others. And since many of men served in the military, their wives were left to run the farms and the household, whether on Long Island or as refugees in Connecticut or in other areas in upstate New York. Loyalist soldiers also left their wives in charge of home and farm, so that many women became actual or de facto war widows. The women had to cope with inflation, scarcity of goods, and the threat of physical violence. Women took over more responsibilities for the outdoor work on the farm. They had always been responsible for the kitchen garden with herbs and vegetables. But when the war disrupted regular routines, women had to cope. Women's experience of independence and greater responsibility during the war may have had some long-lasting effects within the domestic sphere of the family. Historians using records from other areas have traced how the language that men used during this time changed, for example, from referring to my family to our family. And that was a recognition, I think, of women's more equal partnership that may have been a step towards greater independence for women, though that was not achieved politically for many years. Some women who left Long Island followed their husbands in the Army, and not all of the camp followers were prostitutes, as that term may imply. A bicentennial exhibit, that's where I got the Daughters of Liberty photo, opened with a tableau of Martha Washington, and said with the caption that the most famous camp follower of the Revolution. And she certainly did go to, during the winters when the troops were camped, to stay with George. Most of there were prostitutes, probably most of them with the British Army. They had the money to pay. And we know that some of the British officers kept mistresses. But the majority of camp followers provided essential support service for the soldiers. They nursed, cooked, amended uniforms, laundered, foraged for food. And although these are traditional women's work, if you will, the importance of what one historian has referred to as the women of the Army was recognized, since both sides allocated rations to them. And we know, for example, that the Associated Loyalists stationed at Lloyd's Neck near Huntington allocated half rations for women and 1/4 rations for children. Saying Washington wanted to keep the numbers of those camp followers down, but he knew they were essential for the troops. One estimate of the women of the Army is that they numbered 20,000, or perhaps 20% the size of the regular male contingent Army. And an even larger number of women participated in local defensive combat operations. We don't have names or details for Long Island's camp followers or women of the Army, and we don't have any evidence that there were any Long Island women disguised as men, as Deborah Sampson was for several years, who fought in Massachusetts unit. But I want to share one of my favorite revolutionary accounts, though it's from New Jersey. You're probably familiar with the Molly Pitcher stop on the Jersey Turnpike. Now, she may be somewhat legendary. The recent research indicates that Molly Pitchers were so common that it became the name used for women of the Army, like G.I. Joe in the Second World War. And the usual account, the traditional account, is that Molly Pitchers brought pitchers of water to the troops to drink. But if she'd done that on the day of the Battle of Monmouth, it was a very hot day, and the men might well have suffered from heat stroke. But the water that the women assisting artillery companies brought was to swab out the cannons, to extinguish sparks so that the cannon would not explode. And so they were very much actively involved in the military operations, not just a domestic task. task. And we have several accounts of women being able to step in if the man in the artillery unit was wounded or killed. And at the Battle of Monmouth, a soldier, Joseph Plum, records one of those Molly pictures, he didn't put her name down, but that she was reaching over for a cannonball when reaching over for to do her task. A cannonball went ripped through her skirts and through her legs, between her legs. Plum wrote about this because he was so impressed with her coolness under fire. And he records her words, it's a good thing it didn't pass any higher because it would have taken more away. So, much is, back to Long Island, much has been written about the various episodes of whaleboat warfare, guerrilla raids from Connecticut to Long Island. Less familiar but also common were those from New Jersey to western Long Island. And we sometimes forget that the British retaliated with raids on Connecticut. Now, some women themselves were victims in those raids. In 1779, Loyalist Judge Thomas Jones was kidnapped from his home in what is today's Massapequa to exchange for a Patriot General gold cylinder. And the Patriots, and I quote, robbed Mrs. Jones of her wearing apparel and took that of two young ladies in the house, accepting only the clothes upon their backs. Those involved sold the clothes, divided the proceeds, and as that example indicates, unfortunately, whaleboat warfare sometimes degenerated into plundering and stealing by patriots coming from Connecticut or British soldiers occupying the island who pretended to be patriot raiders. They were looting also, whether it be chickens or other things. And many residents buried their silver and their valuables, even if they remained in their homes. They were fearful of being robbed because the British did not maintain law and order during the occupation. And some women and civilian men were killed in those raids. In Major Benjamin Talmadge's successful raid on Fort St. George in Mastic, a newspaper at the time reported a poor woman was also fired on at another house and barbarously wounded through both breasts. Now, some raids were a cover for smuggling. The illicit or so-called London trade, the black market, flourished on Long Island during the war. Many families who stayed on Long Island have lost their physicians who were away in the military, and in their absence, women provided nursing and medical care. And in Huntington, for example, Elizabeth William Potter had often assisted her physician husband, Dr. Gilbert Potter. While he was away serving in the Patriot Army, she attended to the sick in Huntington, both civilians and British soldiers. The co-spy ring is another popular topic, especially with the television series Turn, Washington Spies. It's going to start its third season at the end of April. The television producers have taken considerable dramatic license with Nancy Strong, who may have been involved, but not romantically, with Abraham Woodhull, as the TV series portrayed it. But the traditional story is that Nancy Strong told those coming from Connecticut where to land by a code of how she hung handkerchiefs and petticoats on her clothesline. I'll read the verses by Abigail Halsey wrote from Southampton in the 1940s, I believe, and she has a dozen on different people involved with the spy ring. This on Anna Strong. When Anna Strong took down her wash that mild September night, she saw that Caleb Brewster's boat had just come into sight. There was no light for her to mark the cove he entered in the dark. When morning came and Woodhull looked across the creek again, he saw the old black petticoat still tossing in the rain. Beside it, some white underwear and handkerchiefs were hanging there. 1, 2, 3, 4, he breathed, by Jove, so Brewster's boat is in our cove. This is from the second volume of Morton Pennypacker's Russian Spies, and this part, which he published later, is less well known. But anyway, that's she's got others, but that's Anna Strong. We have no hard evidence for the clothesline. There's several accounts published which were published in the Long Island Forum by Kate Strong, a descendant. And those family stories are virtually our only evidence on Anna Strong's involvement. There is one documented record referring to a woman aiding the spy ring in Setauket. And that and the location of the Strong house do provide some evidence for Nancy Strong's participation, not for the clothesline. But Philadelphia has Betsy Ross, and this flag. Long Island has Nancy Strong and her clothesline, part of our legends and folklore. And on the Culper spy ring, if you want the real story, you should, other than not Turn, but Alex Rose's Washington Spies is the best on the spy ring. Pennypackers is the classic case who discovered it. 1771, 1 in 6 Long Islanders was African American, 17% of the population. Most were enslaved. Queens County, which then included, as I've said, present-day Nassau, had the largest number, more than 2,000. Kings had the highest percentage, 32%. Suffolk, the lowest, 11%. Slightly less than half of those African Americans were women, or female, women and girls. Slavery on Long Island, with a few notable exceptions, was usually on a smaller scale than in the South. Many, but not all, middling families had 1 or 2, perhaps 5 or 6 enslaved blacks who worked side by side with their owners. Their few wealthy large landowners had more than 10 slaves. William Floyd, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, and Mastic, and Josiah Martin, who I've already mentioned in the Rockaways. The Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR, and there's a whole panel about some of the battles they're having these days, have preserved stories of Long Island women, and several of their local chapters, in fact, are named for local women associated with the Revolutionary War. There's an Anna Smith Strong chapter in Setauket. And Edna Yeager has a number of those recounts information on women in her writings. Some of them were published first in a DAR magazine, reprinted in this book, which her daughter published after her mother's death. And William B. Halsey, in his sketches of local history, also has some of those stories, a section on Long Island women in the Revolution. Many of those stories are what I refer to as domestic resistance. And my favorite, I guess, is Mrs. Joseph Osborne in East Hampton. We don't know her first name. She was cooking a berry pudding. Some accounts it's Indian pudding, which is made of corn and molasses. And some nearby British soldiers smelled this from the open hearth and came to her door demanding that she give them some. And they said, "We're just in time. Benny Elkins of Brooklyn told the story in verse, and Halsey quotes it in his, as does Yeager, in briefer form. Here's the response. "Oh, no, you're not," she made reply, then seized the boiling pot, ran with it through the open door and threw it, blazing hot, putting it all down the hill and left it in the sand, amid the curses loud and deep of all the hungry band. The place and tale are widely known, fresh is the legend still, and all East Hampton villagers are proud of Pudding Hill. And East Hampton has Pudding Hill. So maybe there's something to it. Some of these get probably romanticized and exaggerated in telling over the generations. But nonetheless, part of our history and legends. Elsewhere in his book, Halsey tells of Mercy Osborne, who was in her 40s at the time during the Revolution, tells of her living near Poxabog Pond in Sag. And one day during the war, she apparently was walking to Wainscott to visit friends and relatives. When she was, as he said, stopped by an English officer who demanded who she was, where she was going, what her business was. And she replied as follows: "First, I am the mother of Zebedee's children. Secondly, I am going on an errand of mercy. Thirdly, I am attending to my own business, and you would do well to attend to yours." Her reply so impressed the officer that he bade her good speed and went on his way. Southwold historian Augustus Griffin, in his mid-19th century journal, also recorded a number of accounts of women, particularly on the North Fork, and I included one in, again, the Journey's book. Let me share this with you. This is Elizabeth Vale, and oops, let me get the right page. The British were returning from burning New London in 1781 and massacring the garrison at Fort Griswold in Groton. They stopped at Jedediah Vale's. His wife, called Betsy, named Elizabeth, displayed great self-possession and fortitude. She saw them approaching the house without order or discipline and very furious. Mr. Vale kept a house of entertainment, a tavern, in other words, but at this time had no liquors except 2 hogsheads of good cider. It doesn't tell us that was probably hard cider, alcohol. The thought of this cider flashed across her mind and the consequences that would follow should they find it. She went forth alone to the cellar, knocked out the bungs, the stoppers, of the hogshead containing the liquor, and by an almost superhuman effort, turned them in a position so that their contents were soon all flooding the ground floor. She then ascended the stairs in time to meet the unwelcome countenances and forbidding expressions of this ruthless gang, who entered the house more like demons than civilized beings. Their looks she described as awful, having not slept probably within the last 48 hours, and besmeared visibly with the blood of her murdered countrymen at Groton. They flourished their swords and uttered oaths of vengeance on American rebels, seized and bound Mr. Vale and confined him in the garret. They searched every room, pantry, and closet in search of, as they said, something to drink. Finding nothing, the cellar was next resorted to. They there soon discovered that they had been successfully foiled in their wicked purpose. The ground had drank the liquor and was still sober. Like madmen, they ascended to the room of Mrs. Vale and demanded her reasons for depriving them of refreshments. She very deliberately replied, "You are the enemies of my country. I have nothing for you. You have no business here. Threats and oaths don't alarm me. If I have done wrong, I am responsible to my husband, not to you. You will not drink or eat in this house if I can prevent it. She expected violence, but they left the house very soon after, muttering curses for her devotion and fortitude. Another account of domestic resistance. The occupation was most difficult for residents during the winter months when, as I said, there was usually no fighting and soldiers were everywhere on the island. One estimate is that 1 in 6 of residents on Long Island at its peak was a British or Hessian soldier. Some were quartered in private houses, including Raymond Hall, which is now a historic house museum in Oyster Bay. And Sarah, or Sally Townsend, was 18 years old when Colonel John Simcoe selected the Townsend House for his headquarters in 1778. And incidentally, Simcoe was really not such a villain as he's portrayed in that Turn series. Young officers in the Townsend House flirted with Sally and her sisters, who enjoyed the masculine company. And one soldier scratched on a still existing window pane, Miss A.T., the most accomplished young lady in Oyster Bay. A.T. was Audrey, Sally's older sister. And another soldier wrote on a different pane, the adorable Miss Sally Townsend. Colonel Simcoe, he's supposed to have sent Sally a Valentine in 1779, which read in part, "To you, my heart, I must resign. Oh, choose me for your Valentine." Sally Townsend's involvement in the spy ring and the capture of Major John Andre in Westchester County are much more difficult to document, and I don't think Raymond Hall still talks about those aspects. And another legend that's been demolished is the one of Lady 355 in the spy ring, which was a kind of generic term for a woman, and it certainly was not Robert Townsend's lover. Another Lydia Minturn posts so-called personal recollections of the American Revolution, first published in 1859, reprinted in 1970. It's wonderful. It's historical fiction, but it's portrayed as fact. And I have bibliography that refer to some of those articles if you want to look at those myths. British and Hessian soldiers, however, were certainly quartered in houses, barns, or elsewhere on private property throughout Long Island. Women often, as I've said before, had to provide food, and the soldiers certainly disrupted household routines. Were supposed to be paid by American officials for prisoners, by British for their forces. The British would often give IOUs or pay in depreciating currency, and those IOUs usually went uncollected, even at the end of the hostilities, when according to the peace treaties, the British were supposed to settle accounts. The presence of soldiers in an area also brought the fear and reality of rape and venereal disease. Although it is impossible to estimate numbers because many rapes were never reported, investigations by the Continental Congress indicated that they occurred on a large scale. John Stout, I believe, is speaking here maybe in the fall. Yes, no, maybe. Reports British soldiers attacked pregnant women, the elderly, and girls as young as 13 years old, and sometimes gang raped their victims over the course of several days. Loyalist troops also committed rape, and then, as now, those often were not reported. Historian Linda Grant DePaul has observed, and I quote here, "Rape was one of the grievances that made patriots out of neutrals, for women took it more seriously than the British officers." Women usually do. A British officer wrote in a letter regarding rapes on Staten Island, quoting, "The fair nymphs of this isle are in wonderful tribulation, as the fresh meat that our men have got here has made them riotous as satyrs," from Greek mythology. A girl cannot step into the bushes to pluck a rose without running the most imminent risk of being ravished. And they are so little accustomed to these rigorous methods that they don't bear them with the proper resignation. And of consequence, we have the most entertaining court-martials every day. Again, that was Staten Island, but I suspect similar situations on Long Island. Some Long Island women married British soldiers, often those quartered in their home during the occupation, and we have documentation of a number of such weddings. Some young ladies were foiled, like Miss H, we don't know anything about her name other than that, whose family opposed her marriage to a soldier in the Highlander Regiment. And just before the British were to leave at the end of the war, she hoped to leave with the troops dressed like a soldier, but her father came, found her, and took her home. I don't know the ending and whether Miss H and her sweetheart ever did marry. But another incident documented early in the war occurred in today's Glen Cove, involved British Lieutenant James Keating and Patty Pearsall, in whose home he was staying. They fell in love, but he was ordered to return to England. But before he left, he wrote on a window of his bedroom. You know, the women often, the diamonds would scratch things on windows. I don't know whether the British used their swords or what, but they certainly had engraved on windows. His message on that window: "The dear and lovely Patty Pearsall, joy of my heart and comfort of my eyes, the only care and business of my youth." Alas, his ship was lost at sea, and there were no survivors. The news broke Patty's heart. But that window was just returned to Glen Cove, North Shore Historical Museum last year. So we have that record. Historian Silas Wood, writing in 1824, summarized the impact of occupation. Quoting here, the Army was a sanctuary for crimes and robbery, and the grossest offenses by citizens were atoned by enlistment, which shielded them from punishment. Wood wrote that the officers compelled the inhabitants to do all kinds of personal services, to work at their forts, to go with their teams on foraging parties, and to transport their cannon, ammunition, provisions, and baggage. The officers seized and occupied the best rooms in the houses of the inhabitants. They compelled them to furnish blankets and fuel for the soldiers, and hay and grain for their horses. They impressed their horses and wagons for the use of the army. They took away their cattle, sheep, hogs, and poultry, and seized without ceremony and without any compensation, or for such only as they chose to make, whether for their own use, whatever they desired to gratify their wants and wishes. The British occupation of Long Island meant martial law, but not protection of Long Islanders. The British forces, as I've said, often commandeered wood, livestock, hay, and food, and that meant less food and fewer resources for the families. And it was the women who had to cope. Women and children suffered together with the men who were living on the island when the British soldiers plundered, pillaged, and terrorized the civilian population. They seized, as I said, cattle, grain, wagons, denuded the woods and fences for firewood, desecrated Presbyterian churches, and even Quaker meeting houses. Anglican or Episcopal churches usually were spared, but even loyalists were not immune. Many Long Islanders endured abuse from the occupying troops. British martial law, as I've said, did not maintain law and order. whether among soldiers, marauding patriots, or robbers who pretended to be whaleboat raiders. The incidents I've mentioned are samplings from a difficult time. Historian Joseph Tiedemann concludes that the British lost the political struggle, and many Long Islanders who had been neutral, apolitical, or even loyalist at first became patriots after British misconduct against civilians during the occupation, which was exacerbated by officers profiteering at the expense of Long Islanders. If I had more time, I could tell you about Ruth Woodall, Mrs. Howard, the myth of Lady 355, the Petticoat Brigade of 1776, Elizabeth Lewis, the wife of signer Francis Lewis, or Hannah Floyd, Elizabeth Loring, Patty, and others. 1780, the war shifted to the southern colonies, and the British withdrew most of their troops from the East End. Consequently, more petitions came from refugees seeking to return to the island. Others returned after the defeat of Cornwallis at Yorktown in 1781, or when peace was finally achieved in 1783. Almost all the refugees found their property in shambles. Wood wasted and often destroyed altogether. Fields were overgrown, orchards trampled, and it's arguable that Long Island suffered more than anywhere, certainly longer, with the occupation lasting 7 years and 3 months. As I noted earlier, Long Island men who served in the war had wives, mothers, and daughters affected by the revolution. And women bore much of the suffering, whether during the fighting or British-occupied areas like Long Island, or as refugees in Connecticut, or camp followers with the troops. Many became widows, and some themselves were victims of the war. Many women had their household goods stolen, homes and property destroyed. But as I've indicated, a number resisted British demands. Some loyalist women left at the end of the war and became exiles in England, Canada, or the Caribbean. And though we don't have specific documentation, African Americans and Algonquin women doubtless suffered during the occupation as well. The experiences of all these women, whether patriots or loyalists, may not be as romantic as Sally Townsend's Valentine from Colonel Simcoe at Raynham Hall. But Long Island women certainly did more than watch and pray. They endured the battles, skirmishes, and most of all, the calculated humiliations of the seemingly interminable war. But they survived the ordeal. So we need to remember the women during the Revolutionary War. John Adams and other leaders had not taken seriously Abigail Adams' plea in 1776 to remember the ladies in the new Code of Laws seriously. John replied, I cannot but laugh. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. But women coped with the devastations of war and occupation. And after the revolution, they resumed their lives, again embraced domestic concerns, rebuilt families, homes, churches, and communities, thereby doing their share in creating a new nation and Long Island. And in 1848, in Seneca Falls, upstate, Elizabeth Cady Stanton would echo the revolutionary generation in the Declaration of Sentiments. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. That was the beginning of the organized women's rights movement. It would take 72 years for the 19th Amendment for all American women to achieve the vote in 1920. Next year is the centennial of when the women of New York achieved the vote in 1917. The motto of Women's History Month I have there on a tote bag, to write women back into history. So, I thank you for your attention, and I have bibliographies if you want to read more on any of this. And I have a chapter in this book, which is in the bookstore, and a longer version in the Long Island Historical Journal, which is available online in Stony Brook. So, thank you again. Questions, comments?
I just have a question about the Indian population. Were they part of the Suffolk County count?
I don't believe so. I'm not absolutely sure.
And what was their position as far as what side?
I don't know. I don't know. I was trying hard to find something, because I know Marguerite Smith is in court, I guess, and we've got someone here.
Was your question about women?
Women, yeah. About the role of the Native American population, the Indians during the war. I vaguely remember some references to some of the Native Americans fighting in the French and Indian War. I tried to go back to find those, and the fellow has disappeared.
Yeah,
And my computer's crashed.
DAR has published a book.
Oh.
Very fat one. Full of forgotten patriots, and they are American Indian and the population that fought during the war.
Do you know whether any, offhand, whether any were from Long Island?
It's that big.
And you haven't gone through them
Now I
all?
have to go back and confirm.
That's interesting.
A lot of population and the Native American, they have been recognized.
Good, good. Yeah, both sides were promising the African, the enslaved population of freedom if they fought. But I'm glad the DAR is recognized. There was another.
Yes.
Yes.
My question was about the slaves. You said many of them were young men. Were they actually taken into the army to fight?
Question whether the slaves were actually taken into the army to fight. They were promised their freedom, and some did fight on both sides. I don't know specifically Long Island, but in terms of the throughout the country, yes. And Jerry had mentioned, for those who may not have heard in the back, that the DAR has a thick book on African American and Native American who have fought in the war, patriots who have fought in the war. But that's, again, the general, whether there are any there listed as Long Island, don't know at this point. Any other? Ann?
I'm wondering if on the South Fork there was less, let's say, burning of houses and barns than further to the west, where I think already settlements were more dense and there was perhaps more serious and violent fighting. Do you have any?
Well, there was the only real fighting was the Battle of Long Island, August 1776. After that, at best, you get a few skirmishes, Setauket, Sag Harbor, Mastic. I mentioned that assault that the Talmadge did, these railroad warriors coming over. I haven't run across specific burnings of barns and such. They would take the wood if they wanted.
They would occupy it.
Right, but they would first cut it down or take the fences. That was easier to get.
And the burning of the hay over there.
In Coram, they burned the railroad warriors coming across the Long Island Sound, burned hay at Coram. So you don't have, I don't know that much. The Lefferts house burned. I did mention that in Brooklyn. Whether that was, I forget now whether that was a deliberate or accidental as a result of the battles. Because they were right. I said the fighting was Prospect Park and today's Prospect Park and Greenwood Cemetery, and the Lefferts house today is in Prospect Park. Yes?
In your research, did you find how the British might have treated the loyalists or designated the contact that they might have had? Wasn't that the South Shore of Nassau County? There was more population there than.
And in Kings County.
Right, so
but,
maybe you've read or.
You know, the Lefferts account I read, you know, it depended on who the commander was, a lot. And what was the story? That the Bridgehampton one was better or worse than Southampton? I forget now.
Worse, Southampton worse.
Erskine was
Erskine,
more
yeah.
nicer than the Bridgehampton.
Yeah, and in Brooklyn, she said, you know, they generally, in Brooklyn, but that's before the fighting too. And, you know, so I'm sure it varied a lot. And they, as I said, they spared the Anglican or Episcopal churches. Usually.
They knew who the fruit people
Yeah,
were,
yeah,
obviously.
where, you know, the Presbyterians were presumed to be patriots. Quakers tried to be neutral, given their pacifism, but the British didn't particularly respect that. So they took over some of the Quaker meeting houses. Any other questions or comments or whatever? Again, if you want a bibliography, I've got information on my, this book, Women in Long Island's Past, which covers much more than the Revolution. But, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.